I am Chloe Holland, 38 years old, an Army officer. Last Sunday, my own sister shoved me hard, sending me flying away from the dinner table. She didn't do it in the dark. She did it right in front of my mother and two close friends in the very house where I had bled $3,800 of my monthly salary for 5 straight years to pay the mortgage. My back hit the cold tile floor my father laid himself 20 years ago. No one helped me up. Just laughter. The whole table erupted in that cold, mocking sound thrown at me like I had been stripped of all dignity. I looked up, stared directly at them, and smiled softly. "Enjoy your meal," I said, standing up and smoothing my shirt. "This is your last free dinner." I pulled out my phone. One tap on the send button, cold as pulling a trigger. By morning, 73 missed calls. Before I tell you what that tap did, take a second to like and subscribe, and leave your location and local time in the comments. I always like to know where you're listening from. Now let me take you back 5 years to the week I signed a mortgage that wasn't mine. My father died on a Wednesday in October. The smell of burnt grass and motor oil. That is what I remember most about the day the world stopped. My father did not die in a hospital bed surrounded by flowers. He went down in the front yard of our suburban Chicago home, his heart giving out while his hands were still white-knuckled around the steering wheel of his old John Deere mower. I was 50 miles away, mid-stride in a field training exercise when the call came through. By the time I pulled my rusted Ford into the driveway, the paramedics were gone. Only the hum of the idling mower remained chugging along until the tank ran dry. He left behind a jar of ashes, a widow who could not balance a checkbook, and a neon orange foreclosure notice taped to the front door. $187,000. That was the price of our history. The only piece of dirt the Holland family ever owned was about to vanish into the pocket of a bank in downtown Chicago. 2 days after the funeral, we sat around the oak kitchen table. It was a graveyard of crumpled napkins and cooling coffee. My mother Lorraine sat at the head, her eyes red and vacant. My sister Carla sat opposite me, scrolling through her phone, her thumb clicking against the glass with a rhythm that made my jaw ache. Carla was 42, twice divorced, and currently unemployed. Her credit score was a dumpster fire. My mother had no income. Every pair of eyes in that room eventually landed on me. I was the officer, the one with the steady government paycheck, the one with the perfect 738 credit score. "We are drowning, Chloe," my mother whispered. She did not look at the bills. She looked at me. My military brain kicked into high gear. I saw a squad in trouble. I saw a perimeter failing. I did what I was trained to do. I took the objective. I did not realize then that in my family being a soldier just meant being a target. The mortgage office was a miserable hole in a strip mall. The carpet smelled like old coffee and damp cardboard. A fluorescent light overhead hummed with a sharp electric buzz that set my teeth on edge. I sat across from a loan officer who looked like he had not seen the sun since the 90s. He slid a stack of papers toward me. I hesitated. The air in the room felt thin. Then I felt it. My mother's hand reached over and clamped onto my forearm. She did not just hold me, she squeezed. I could feel her fingernails biting into my skin, leaving deep red crescents. It was a desperate, primal grip. "I promise, Chloe." She sobbed, the sound wet and jagged. "We will all chip in. Carla will help. I will find a way. I just cannot lose this house. I cannot die anywhere else." I looked at the red marks on my arm. I looked at her tears. I took the pen. The nib scratched against the paper, a harsh, dry sound in the silent office. One signature, then another. I tied myself to a $228,000 debt, interest included. I felt the weight of the house settle onto my shoulders, heavy as a full rucksack on a 20-mile march. For the first 3 months, things worked. My mother sent her portion. Carla made noise about a job. Then the silence started. By the 4th month, the check stopped. When I called home, Lorraine had a new excuse every time. A phantom chest pain, a broken water heater, a rough patch for Carla. The 5th month was the turning point. I was standing in the middle of a wind-swept training field, the sky a bruised purple. My face was caked in dust and sweat. My phone vibrated against my ribs. I pulled it out, expecting a tactical update. It was a bank alert. An automatic withdrawal of $3,800. I stared at the screen as my checking account emptied. That money was my rent. It was my food. It was my future. I stood there surrounded by soldiers, feeling more alone than I ever had in a foxhole. The cold wind bit through my uniform, but the ice was inside me. My mother had not just used my credit, she had weaponized my loyalty. She knew I would never let the house fall. She knew I would bleed so they could sit on the porch and drink wine. I closed my eyes and took a breath of the dry, dusty air. I realized then that I was not protecting a squad. I was being picked clean by scavengers. My father's house had become my cage, and my own mother had turned the key. I looked at the notification one last time before shoving the phone back into my pocket. $3,800. Every single month. "Holland, get a move on," my sergeant barked. I snapped to attention. My back was straight, my face a mask of granite. I stepped into the mud and kept marching. I was a soldier after all. And a soldier knows when they have been ambushed. I was on a battlefield with no cover and no backup. But they forgot one thing about people like me. We know how to strike back. 14 months into my sentence as the family bank, the front door of the Holland house swung open for a new tenant. Carla was back. She did not come back with a suitcase and a plan. She arrived with 4 massive hard-shell rollers that groaned against the driveway and a designer handbag slung over her shoulder like a trophy. She had finished her second divorce the way she finished everything messy, broke, and looking for someone else to clean up the spill. She dropped her keys on the oak kitchen table, the same table where I'd signed away my freedom, and looked around like she was checking into a Hilton. "Just for a few weeks," she told our mother Lorraine. "Just until I get my feet under me." A few weeks turned into months. The weeks were measured in the trash cans out back, which started filling up with empty bottles of expensive Chardonnay and takeout containers from the Italian place downtown. Her clothes, mountains of synthetic fabrics and fast fashion tags, began to migrate. They invaded the laundry room. They spilled over the couch. I was still bleeding $3,800 every month into that mortgage, hoping that maybe she would throw $20 toward the water bill. The amount she contributed, 0. Not a cent. Not even a thank you. That did not sound like a demand for more. I tried to talk to my mother. I went to her room, the air thick with the smell of lavender spray and old newspapers. I laid my bank statements on her bedspread, white paper, black ink, red numbers. I pointed to the utility spikes. I asked as calmly as my military training allowed, when Carla was going to start carrying her own weight. Lorraine did not even look at the numbers. She did not look at the proof of my exhaustion. She sat up, her face twisting into that practiced look of wounded motherhood. "Your sister is at rock bottom, Chloe." She snapped the words sharp and defensive. "She just lost her marriage. She is grieving. Don't make this harder than it has to be. You have your army salary. You're fine." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My own mother was using Carla's failures as a leash to keep me in line. It was a shield, a barrier she erected to protect the child she liked from the child she used. I felt a knot form in my throat, a dry, bitter lump I couldn't swallow. I turned and walked out without another word. To keep that 3-bedroom house with the manicured lawn standing, I had turned my own life into a bunker. I had moved out of my decent apartment and rented a studio 40 miles from the base. It was a shithole. The pipes groaned and bled rust-colored water every morning. The radiator clanked like a dying machine. My old Ford, with 190,000 miles on the dash, screamed every time I turned the key. Most nights I sat on a milk crate and ate black beans and rice straight out of a plastic bowl. It was the same bland, salty mush as a field MRE, but without the camaraderie. I lived like a ghost in my own life, stripping away every comfort, every hobby, every scrap of joy just to feed the machine back home. I stayed disciplined. I stayed quiet. I hid the shame of my own exploitation behind a stiff spine and a pressed uniform. One Sunday, a rare afternoon of leave, I drove back to the house to pick up an old winter coat I'd left in the hall closet. The neighborhood was quiet, the lawns green and indifferent. I let myself in. The hallway smelled like Carla, that heavy, cloying, cheap perfume that always gave me a headache. I walked up the stairs, my boots thudding against the carpet I'd paid to have steam cleaned 2 months ago. I reached for the handle of my childhood bedroom. The knob did not turn. I twisted it again harder this time. My body weight shifted, anticipating the give of the latch. Nothing. I looked closer. There was a new lock set, shiny brass, secure. It sat there like a middle finger in the center of the door. Carla had not just moved into my room, she had locked me out of it. She had taken the only space I had left in the house I was buying and claimed it as her sovereign territory. I stood in that hallway, the smell of her perfume choking me, and looked at the door. I was the one paying the taxes. I was the one paying the insurance. I was the one eating beans on a milk crate so the lights stayed on. And yet here I was, standing in my own hallway, feeling like a goddamn intruder. If you've ever been the one holding the line while someone else took the credit, or if you've been the reliable one that everyone feels entitled to use, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. It helps get Chloe's story to the people who need to hear it. And I want to hear from you. Drop a locked out in the comments if you've ever had a family member cross a line you thought was uncrossable. I read every single one. I didn't pound on the door. I didn't scream for my mother. I just stood there, my hand still hovering near the cold brass of the new lock. I realized then that I wasn't a daughter or a sister in this house. I was just an ATM with a pulse. I turned around and walked back down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't take my coat. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out the front door and let it click shut behind me. The temporary arrangement was over. I just hadn't told them yet. The third week of November. November 21st. My 38th birthday. I woke up at 0500, my body still locked into the internal clock of a soldier on deployment. I looked at my phone, a black slab of plastic sitting on the milk crate next to my bed. The screen was blank. No happy birthday Chloe from Lorraine, no love you sis from Carla. Not even a generic, automated notification they'd bothered to click. I was 38, and in the eyes of my blood, I had ceased to exist. My only function was a monthly direct deposit of $3,800. The base was cold that morning. A biting Chicago wind whipped through the barracks, smelling of damp concrete and jet fuel. I kept my head down. I kept my spine straight. I didn't expect a cake. I didn't expect a song. But the silence from home felt like a physical weight, heavier than any rucksack I'd ever carried. Around 1400, Margot, the quartermaster sergeant, walked past my desk. She was a hard-edged woman with skin like cured leather and a gaze that could strip paint. She didn't stop. She didn't smile. She just slid a small plastic container onto the edge of my workspace. Inside was a single grocery store cupcake with neon blue frosting that looked like lard and sugar. Stuck in the center was a small, flickering candle in the shape of a number 8. Welcome to the 38 Club, Holland. Margot muttered, her voice a low rasp. She patted my shoulder, once a heavy, honest strike, and kept walking. That was it. A stranger had remembered what my mother had traded for a mortgage payment. I took the cupcake and walked toward the latrine at the end of the hall. I needed to be alone. I needed to disappear. I locked the door of the last stall. I didn't sit. I stood there looking at that pathetic little candle flickering in the dim fluorescent light. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from the sudden violent realization that I was a ghost in my own life. I reached out and slammed my palm against the button of the industrial hand dryer on the wall. The machine roared. A violent rattling scream of hot air that filled the small space. Under the cover of that mechanical noise, I let go. I didn't just cry, I broke. I leaned over the sink, my shoulders heaving, gasping for air that tasted like bleach and industrial soap. I cried for the daughter who had signed her life away. I cried for the father who wasn't there to stop it. I cried for the lard frosting cupcake that was the only proof I was still alive. Exactly 4 minutes. That was all I allowed myself. When the dryer finally cut out, the silence was absolute. I splashed cold water on my face, looking at the officer in the mirror. Her eyes were bloodshot, but the haze was gone. The victim had died in that stall. The soldier had survived. That night I drove. I didn't go back to my shithole studio apartment. I drove to the old neighborhood. A cold, drizzling rain was falling, blurring the streetlights into smudges of orange and white on the windshield. I parked 20 yards down from the house, killed the engine, and sat in the dark. The house was glowing. Every light was on. It looked like a goddamn lantern in the middle of the street. Several cars I didn't recognize were parked on the lawn I paid to have mowed. I pulled out my phone and opened Instagram. There it was. Carla's latest post. A video. She was standing at the head of the oak table, the one where my father used to sit. She was holding a glass of deep red wine, laughing as she toasted a dozen people crammed into the dining room. She was using my mother's good china, the set I had spent $300 to have professionally moved and insured. To the single and free life, Carla yelled in the video, her voice high and shrill with wine. To a new beginning in a house that finally feels like home. She was celebrating her freedom in a house built on my blood money. She was playing hostess with my salary while I sat in a rusted Ford eating a grocery store cupcake under a leaking sky. The rain drummed against the roof of the car, a steady rhythmic thud like a funeral march. I didn't storm inside. I didn't scream. Discipline taught me that you never attack until you've mapped the terrain. I watched the shadows move behind the curtains. I watched them drink my wine and eat my food. Then I put the car in gear and drove away. I went back to my studio. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat at the small metal desk and opened my laptop. The blue light hit my face, cold and clinical. I didn't search for comfort. I didn't search for a way to fix things with Lorraine. I typed 5 words into the search bar. Illinois property law, equitable lien. I spent the next 6 hours reading case law, statutes, foreclosure procedures. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I was a creditor. Every cent I had paid every repair I had funded, every signature I had scratched into those bank documents. It wasn't a gift. It was a weapon. As the sun began to gray the edges of the Chicago skyline, I closed the laptop with a soft final click. I looked out at the street, my face a mask of granite. The fire was lit. Now I just had to decide how much I wanted to let burn. I stood up and smoothed my uniform. My 39th year was starting today, and it was going to be the most expensive year of Carla's life. The laser printer in the administrative office hummed until the plastic casing felt hot to the touch. 60 months of bank statements make for a hell of a book. 5 years of my life stacked in a crisp white pile that smelled of burnt toner and desperation. I sat there with a neon yellow highlighter, my back locked straight against the hard plastic of the chair. I wasn't just an officer in that moment. I was an auditor of my own betrayal. I tagged every mortgage payment, every emergency transfer I'd sent to my mother's account, every overdraft fee that had hit me like a physical blow because they couldn't stop spending money I hadn't even made yet. I compressed the digital versions into a single folder on my encrypted drive. I named it evidence_01. It didn't feel like a family history. It felt like a Target package. Saturday morning arrived with a gray, heavy sky. I drove to the house. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want them to have time to hide the trash. I told Lorraine I was there to check a supposed leak in the basement pipes. It was a flimsy pretext, but it worked. My mother was slumped in her recliner, the flickering blue light of a game show washing over her face. She didn't even look up when I walked in. The house smelled like stale air and Carla's cloying, sickly sweet perfume. I went straight for the kitchen. My eyes scanned the cluttered counters like a thermal sweep. Discipline means never missing the small stuff. The details are where the lies live. Under a half-empty coffee mug, I saw a scrap of paper. I pulled it out with 2 fingers. It was a printed Venmo ledger, coffee-stained and crumpled. My eyes locked on one recurring name, T. Ramos. Plus $600. The note attached was simple, rent for March. $600. While I was skipping meals and driving a rusted-out Ford to cover a $3,800 mortgage, Carla was running a side hustle in my house. She was pocketing $600 a month under the table tax-free while I bled out financially. I pulled my phone from my pocket, adjusted the angle to avoid the glare of the overhead fluorescent light, and took 3 clean shots. Clear, legible, damning. I walked upstairs, my boots silent on the carpet I was still paying for. I stopped in front of my old bedroom door. The shiny brass lock was still there, a mocking middle finger in the center of the wood. But it wasn't just the lock this time. Sitting right on the threshold was a pair of scuffed brown leather work boots, size 11. They were caked in dried mud and fresh sawdust. The smell hit me instantly: sour sweat, old tobacco, and the stench of a man who didn't belong in my home. A stranger was living in my childhood room. The room where my father used to read to me. The room where my medals were once pinned to the wall before they were boxed up and forgotten. Carla hadn't just stolen the space. She had pimping out my history to a tenant for $600 a month. I knelt down on one knee, my joints popping in the quiet hallway. I photographed the boots. I photographed the lock. I photographed the trail of mud leading into the room. I felt a cold, hard anger settle into the base of my spine. It was the kind of anger that doesn't need to scream. It just needs a plan. Monday morning, back at the base, the air felt cleaner. I spread the photos and the bank statements across my desk like a tactical map. Margot leaned over the table, her face looking like a piece of weathered granite. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't offer a pitying look. She just looked at the Venmo statement and then at the photo of the size 11 boots. She stood up slowly, crossing her thick arms over her chest. "Don't call them family anymore, Holland," she said. Her voice was low, vibrating with a rough, dangerous edge. "Family doesn't sell your bedroom to a stranger for beer money while you're out there eating dirt for them. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is theft, plain and simple." I didn't answer. I just stared at the red highlighter marks on the page. Margot reached into her chest pocket and pulled out a business card. It was matte black heavy paper with nothing but a name and a number embossed in silver. She slid it across the desk toward me. It made a soft, sibilant sound against the metal. "Call Patricia Holloway." Margot said, her eyes locked onto mine. "She's not a regular lawyer. She's a wolf. And you're going to need a wolf to bite back against people who think they can eat your life and call it love." I picked up the card. The edges were sharp enough to draw blood. I looked at the photos of the house, the boots, and the bank statements one last time. The girl who signed that mortgage was gone. The officer who was tired of being a target was finally standing up. I tucked the card into my pocket and felt the weight of it. "Thanks, Margot," I said. My voice was as flat and cold as the floor of that mortgage office. "Don't thank me yet," Margot grunted. "Wait until the house starts burning." I walked out of the office and into the bright, harsh light of the motor pool. I didn't look back. I had my intelligence. I had my ally. Now I just needed to let the wolf off the leash. Sunday dinner at the Holland house used to smell like my father's slow-cooked pot roast and wood smoke. Now it just smelled of stale air and the greasy scent of store-bought chicken Carla had tossed onto a platter. We sat in the dining room under the dim yellow light of a fixture that had been buzzing for 3 years. No one had fixed it. No one ever fixed anything unless I paid for the parts and the labor. Carla was scrolling through her phone between bites, her long blood-red acrylic nails clicking against the screen like a telegraph. Lorraine sat at the head of the table, cutting her meat into tiny, obsessive squares. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone is waiting for the bank to call. I laid my fork down. The metal made a sharp, clean sound against the porcelain. I didn't look at my mother. I looked straight at Carla. The mortgage adjusted. "My monthly is up," I said. My voice was flat, the way I deliver a briefing on a supply shortage. "I need you to start pitching in $600 a month, starting now." The table went dead. Carla stopped scrolling. She didn't look up at first. She just stared at her screen for 5 seconds before slowly setting the phone face down on the table. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing until they were just 2 slits of cold, dark spite. Then came the sound. She dragged her fork across the bottom of her plate, a long, screeching metallic whine that set my teeth on edge. "Are you serious right now?" Her voice was high, hitting that shrill, jagged note she saved for when she wanted to play the martyr. "You think because you wear a uniform and get a government check, you can just walk in here and bark orders? 600, Carla." "That's the number," I said. It was the exact amount she was pocketing from the stranger in my boots, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing I'd been in her room. "You're a piece of work, Chloe," she spat, leaning forward. She pointed one of those red nails at my face. "You think writing a few checks makes you the boss? I'm here 24/7. I'm the one taking Mom to her appointments. I'm the one doing the grocery runs. I'm the one keeping this family together while you're off playing soldier." She threw her hands up in a grand, sweeping gesture. If we're talking about money, let's talk. If I charged a professional rate for home health care and elder care, you'd owe me $50,000 a year. Minimum. You're lucky I don't send you an invoice. I didn't blink. I didn't argue. You don't negotiate with a narcissist when they're in the middle of a script. I turned my gaze to my mother. Lorraine wouldn't look at me. She was staring at her napkin, her fingers trembling as she smoothed out a wrinkle that wasn't there. Over and over. Her eyes were wet, that practiced shimmer of tears she used whenever things got uncomfortable. Mom, I said, why do you have to do this? Chloe, she whispered, her voice cracking. Why do you have to come in here and pick fights? Your sister is trying so hard. She's had a terrible year. Her life is in pieces. I'm the one paying for the pieces, Mom, I said. She told me she was helping you. Lorraine's voice rose, turning into a frantic, shaky plea. She told me she's been Venmoing you $300 every month. She said you two had an agreement. Why are you lying to me? I felt the blood drain from my face. A cold electric jolt hit the base of my skull. I looked at Carla. She didn't look guilty. She looked bored. She picked up a piece of chicken and chewed it slowly, watching me with a smirk that said she knew exactly what she'd done. She hadn't just stolen my money. She hadn't just stolen my room. She had poisoned my mother's mind, turning me into the greedy, lying villain so she could stay the golden child while living off my sweat. They were a team now. A parasite and its host united against the person keeping the roof over their heads. The air in the room felt like it was being sucked out. The smell of the chicken made me want to gag. I realized then that there was no saving this. There was no conversation that would make Lorraine see the truth because the truth was too expensive for her to acknowledge. She needed Carla's lies to feel okay about using me. I stood up slowly. My chair made a dull thud against the floor. I didn't throw a plate. I didn't scream. I reached over, grabbed my coat from the back of the chair, and zipped it up. My movements were precise, disciplined. I see, I said. My voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper, but it cut through Carla's smirking silence like a razor. Yeah, you see, Carla mocked, leaning back and crossing her arms. Go back to your little shithole apartment, Chloe. We're doing just fine here without your attitude. I didn't look back. I walked through the kitchen past the pile of unopened mail I knew were late notices for bills they'd ignored. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut. The click of the latch sounded like a final judgment. The Chicago night was biting a damp wind coming off the lake that tasted like iron. I walked to my rusted Ford, my boots crunching on the gravel. I got inside, but I didn't start the engine. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the matte black business card Margot had given me. The silver lettering of Patricia Holloway caught the faint light of the street lamp. My hand was steady. I dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, low, calm, and sounding like she'd been expecting the call. This is Patricia, she said. My name is Chloe Holland, I said, looking at the glowing windows of the house I was paying for. I have a house I need to burn down. Legally. I heard you were coming, Patricia replied. Do you have the evidence? I have everything, I said. I hung up and started the car. The engine groaned, then roared to life. As I pulled away, I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel guilty. I felt the way a soldier feels when the fog finally lifts and the enemy position is clear. The family was gone. Now there was only the mission. Tuesday morning was sharp gray and tasted like damp iron. Patricia Holloway's office was on the 20th floor of a glass tower that overlooked the cold churn of Lake Michigan. There were no family photos on her desk, no framed drawings from grandkids. Just thick leather-bound statutes, a heavy brass paperweight, and the smell of coffee so black it looked like motor oil. Patricia was a woman built of straight lines and gray wool. She didn't offer me a seat until she had finished reading the first 10 pages of evidence_01. The folder made a heavy dead thud when I dropped it onto the oak surface. I stood by the window, my hands locked behind my back in a parade rest. I watched the traffic crawl along the Kennedy Expressway, thousands of people heading to jobs they hated to pay for lives they couldn't afford. I was one of them. For 60 months, I had been the fuel for a house that was burning me alive. Patricia flipped through the bank statements, her thumb making a dry, rhythmic sound against the paper, snap, snap, snap. She lingered on the photos of the size 11 work boots and the Venmo receipts I'd harvested from the kitchen counter. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. A small jagged smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't a kind look. It was the look of a predator that had just caught the scent of blood in the water. They didn't just borrow your life, Officer Holland, she said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. They picked the bones clean. Most people come to me when they're bruised. You've been hollowed out. But generosity has a strict expiration date in this state. Yours ended 48 months ago. She cleared a space on the desk and laid out a yellow legal pad. The pen she used was heavy silver and looked like a weapon. She began to map out the hit. Phase 1. We cut the cord. You stop every automatic payment today. Not tomorrow. Today. Patricia looked at me, her gaze hard and clinical. The bank will come knocking. Let them. Phase 2. I'm drafting a formal demand letter. We give your mother 30 days to refinance and pull your name off that deed. But we both know she can't. She has no income, and Carla is a ghost to the credit bureaus. And when they fail, I asked. My voice was flat, echoing the coldness of the room. Phase 3. Patricia said, tapping the silver pen against the desk. We file a partition lawsuit. We force a sale. The court will order the house sold on the courthouse steps if necessary. You'll get your equity back, or at least a portion of what you bled into it. She paused, watching me closely. Your credit score is a 738. It's a trophy. After this, you're going to drop 40 points, maybe more. You ready for that? I didn't blink. I'd walked through mortar fire in the Middle East. I'd seen things that made a credit score look like a child's toy. 40 points is a cheap price for my life back, I said. Do it. I reached for the silver pen to sign the retainer. My hand was steady, my grip firm. This wasn't a tragedy anymore. It was a tactical withdrawal. Ping! My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a call from the base. It was a text from a number I hadn't seen in 2 years. Neil Briggs, Carla's ex-husband. The man she'd chewed up and spat out before moving on to me. The message was 5 words long. Thought you should know this. There was one attachment, a PDF. I opened the file. It was a financial affidavit Carla had filed with the Cook County Civil Court just last month. It was part of her ongoing attempt to dodge child support payments for the 2 kids she barely saw. I scrolled down to the income section. Under penalty of perjury, with her signature scrawled at the bottom, she had claimed her total monthly income was exactly $0. No job, no side income, no rent. A cold electric heat flooded my chest. I turned the phone around and slid it across the oak desk to Patricia. The lawyer leaned in. She read the document once, then twice. She started to laugh, a short, dry sound like dead leaves blowing across a sidewalk. $0, she whispered. While she's pocketing $600 a month from a tenant in your bedroom, under the table, no taxes, no reporting. Patricia laced her fingers together, her eyes bright with a dangerous, focused light. She didn't just lie to you, Chloe. She lied to a judge. She swore an oath to the state of Illinois that she was destitute while she was running a black market boarding house on your dime. The silver pen felt heavy in my hand. The weight of it was comforting. What does that change? I asked. It changes everything, Patricia said, her voice dropping an octave. We don't need 30 days. We don't need to wait for her to play victim. This isn't just a civil dispute anymore. This is criminal fraud. This is perjury. She looked at me, the predator's smile returning. The bomb is built, Holland. The fuse is short. You want to be the one to light it. I stood up and smoothed the front of my uniform. I adjusted my belt, making sure everything was square and tight. I looked at the black business card on the desk, and then in the draft of the lawsuit, Patricia was already typing up. Draft the email, I said. Copy Carla, copy my mother, copy Neil's lawyers. Send the whole evidence_01 file as an attachment. You sure? Patricia asked, her finger hovering over the keyboard. Once this goes, there's no calling it back. It's scorched earth. I thought about the boots on my threshold. I thought about the cupcake with the blue lard frosting. I thought about the laugh at the dinner table while I was lying on the floor. Send it, I said. I want them to see it coming before the roof hits the floor. I didn't wait for her to click the mouse. I walked out of the office, my boots clicking sharply against the marble floor of the lobby. I stepped out into the Chicago wind, pulled my coat tight, and started the walk back to my car. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was on the front lawn. And I was finally the one holding the map. The smell of butter and yellow cornmeal filled my studio apartment, thick enough to mask the scent of rust from the sink. I stood over the oven, watching the crust of the cornbread turn a deep golden brown. This was my father's recipe, the one he made every Sunday before the world went sideways. I didn't make it for them. I made it for the memory of the man who actually earned the roof over our heads. I wrapped the warm tray in heavy-duty foil, the metal crinkling loud in the silence of my room. This was it. The last meal. The final rite of a daughter who was done being a martyr. I drove to the red brick house with the heater off, letting the Chicago chill keep my head clear. My spine was a rod of cold iron against the seat. When I walked through the front door, the house was screaming with noise. Carla had invited Aunt Ruth and 2 of her bridge club friends over. The air was heavy with cheap wine and the smell of store-bought roast chicken. I walked into the kitchen and set the cornbread on the counter. No one looked up. No one said thank you. I was just a ghost delivering the mail. We sat at the oak table, the one I was still paying for. Carla was at the head, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet. She looked like she owned the world, despite having $0 in her bank account and a boarding house running in my old bedroom. She leaned back, her red acrylic nails clicking against the glass. "Next week, the contractors are coming," Carla announced, her voice dripping with the unearned confidence of a golden child. "We're ripping up this old hardwood on the second floor. It's trash. I'm thinking wide plank white oak. It'll brighten the place up." I stopped chewing. I looked at the floor, then back at her. My voice was low, a steady hum. "With what money, Carla?" The laughter at the table died instantly. Carla's face shifted from smug to feral in a heartbeat. She slammed her wine glass down so hard the red liquid splashed across the white tablecloth like a fresh wound. "What is your problem, Chloe?" She hissed, her eyes darting to her friends to make sure she had an audience. "You think, because you write a few checks, you get to dictate how we live. You aren't the head of this house. You're just the help. You're the maid who happens to wear a uniform." The word maid hung in the air, foul and heavy. I looked at my mother. Lorraine was hunched over her plate, obsessively picking at a piece of bread, her eyes locked on the table. She didn't defend me. She didn't tell Carla to shut up. She just sat there in her cowardly silence, letting her favorite child spit on the person keeping the lights on. I stood up to get a glass of water, my chair scraping harshly against the tile. I needed to move before I choked on the disrespect. When I came back toward the table, Carla was standing in my path. She had pulled my chair back, blocking me, her chin tilted up in a jagged challenge. "Sit down and shut up, Chloe," she snapped. "Nobody wants your attitude at dinner." I didn't say a word. I reached for the back of my chair to pull it back into place. Carla's hand shot out. She didn't just nudge me. She planted both palms on my shoulders and shoved with everything she had. I wasn't expecting it. My boots slipped on the slick tile. I went down hard. My back hit the floor, the very tiles my father had laid with his own hands 20 years ago. The impact knocked the wind out of me. I laid there for a second, staring at the ceiling, the air trapped in my lungs like a stone. Then the sound started. Laughter. Carla roared. Aunt Ruth chuckled into her napkin. Even her friends joined in, their cackles echoing off the walls of the house I had bled for. They looked down at me like I was a broken toy, a joke they'd finally finished telling. I looked at my mother. She wasn't laughing, but she wasn't moving either. She just watched. In that moment, every ounce of daughterly guilt evaporated. Every drop of loyalty turned to ash. I felt a strange cold peace wash over me. I rolled onto my side and pushed myself up. I didn't brush the dust off my pants. I stood straight, squared my shoulders, and felt the weight of my uniform. "Enjoy your meal," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through their laughter like a razor. "It's the last free one you'll ever have." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen. The email was already drafted. The evidence. The lawsuit. The betrayal. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, or if you've been pushed to the edge by the very people you were trying to save, hit that like button right now. It means the world. And do me a favor, comment "gone" below. if you've ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to save yourself. Your support keeps Chloe's story moving. I didn't look at Carla. I didn't look at the wine stains on the table. I just pressed send. One tap. Cold as pulling a trigger. I watched the progress bar slide across the screen until it vanished. Sent. I turned around and walked out the door. I didn't look back at the red brick house. I didn't look back at the people inside. I stepped into the cold Chicago night, my spine straight, my face a mask of granite. The fuse was lit. By tomorrow morning, the house would be burning, and for the first time in 5 years, I was the one holding the match. The hot water in my studio apartment's shower hissed like a broken radiator. I stood under the stream until the air in the bathroom was thick enough to drown in the steam swirling around me like a heavy wet shroud. The water hit the bruises on my back, the ones from the cold tile floor, but I didn't wince. For the first time in 60 months, the weight didn't feel like it was crushing my lungs. $3,800. That was the price of my liberty, and it sounded like the rhythmic drumming of water against a plastic curtain. I stepped out, dried my hair with a threadbare towel, and walked into the dim living room. My phone was sitting on the glass coffee table. It didn't ring. It screamed. It rattled against the glass, the vibration a steady, frantic hum that cut through the silence of the shithole studio. I sat on the edge of my bed and watched the screen light up the dark room like a strobe. By 0600, the tally was in. Damage assessment: 73 missed calls, 41 text messages, 3 voicemails. The fortress of lies was falling, and the rats inside were scratching at the walls until their claws bled. I didn't call back. I didn't text. I made a pot of black coffee, sat on my milk crate, and hit the speakerphone. Voicemail 1, 21:47 hours, Lorraine. Her voice was thin, reedy, and vibrating with a panic that felt practiced, like a script she had memorized years ago. Chloe, please, answer me. I think I'm having a heart attack. You can't do this. You're killing your mother. Call me right now. I took a sip of the coffee. Cold, bitter, just like the love she'd been selling me for $228,000. Voicemail 2, 23:15 hours. Carla. This one was pure acid. No tears, just teeth. You cold-blooded bitch. You think a lawyer is going to scare me? I live here. You signed the papers. I'll burn this house to the ground before I let you take it. You're dead to me. You hear that, dead? Voicemail 3, 03:20 hours. The tone had shifted. The acid had turned to ash. Carla again, but the bravado was gone. Her voice was cracked, shrill, and hovering on the edge of a total breakdown. The legal reality of perjury and mortgage fraud had finally clawed its way into her brain. Chloe, Neil called, the lawyers. They're talking about jail. Please. We're family. Just stop this. Tell them it was a mistake. Please, Chloe. I deleted the messages, one after another. A clean sweep of the drive. Tuesday morning at the base was clear and biting. I stood near the motor pool, my uniform crisped my back, a line of cold iron. The wind smelled of diesel and wet pavement. I was finishing a status report when I heard the screech of tires. Carla's beat-up sedan swerved into the access road, blowing past the visitor markers and sliding to a halt near the security checkpoint. She didn't wait for the guards. She lunged out of the car. Her hair was a tangled mess of blonde dye and grease. Her makeup was smeared across her face in jagged black streaks. She looked like a ghost that had been dragged through a swamp. She saw me and started screaming before her boots hit the gravel. "You have to stop this," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the corrugated metal of the hangars. "Withdraw the filing, tell the court." Neil lied. A dozen soldiers stopped what they were doing. They stood there, grease-stained and weary, watching the spectacle. Margot stepped out of the office, her arms crossed her eyes like flint. I didn't retreat. I didn't hide. I walked toward the perimeter line, my steps measured and rhythmic. I stopped 5 feet from her. I didn't look at her mess. I looked through it. "This is a military installation, Carla," I said. My voice was quiet, but it had the weight of a stone. "You're trespassing. Back up." "I don't care about your job," she yelled, her face turning a mottled, ugly purple. "You're ruining Mom's life. You're putting me in a cage. Fix this now." She tried to lunge forward, her red acrylic nails clawing at the air. I didn't move an inch. I didn't have to. The air between us felt like a wall. I gave Mom 5 years, I said. I made sure my voice was loud enough for every man and woman in that motor pool to hear. 60 months, 60 payments, $228,000 of my blood and my sweat. I carried this family until my back broke. I took a step closer, forcing her to look up at me. And what did you give her, Carla, besides lies? Besides a size 11 squatter in my childhood bedroom, besides an affidavit that says you're broke while you're pocketing rent money under the table. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the wind whistling through the chain-link fence. Carla's mouth opened, then shut. She looked around at the soldiers. She saw the disgust in their eyes. She saw the granite wall of Margot's face. She looked for a lie, for a pivot, for a way to play the victim, but there were no more scripts left. The parasite was finally out of hosts. Back away from the line, I repeated. Carla took a step back, then another. She looked small, shrunken, a rat caught in a floodlight. She turned and scrambled back into her car, the tires spitting gravel as she fled the base like a thief in the night. I watched the dust settle. My hands were steady. My heart rate hadn't even climbed. I turned back to my squad. Get back to work, I said. I walked back to my desk, but I didn't pick up the report. My phone was silent now. But the real storm was just beginning. I had one more cord to cut, the most dangerous one of all. I pulled the matte black card from my pocket. It was time to call Lorraine. Thursday night in my studio apartment was a tomb. The city of Chicago roared outside the thin glass, a muffled chaos of sirens and tires on wet pavement. But in here, there was only the hum of a dying refrigerator and the scent of cold, burnt coffee. I sat on the edge of my bed, a twin mattress on the floor because I couldn't afford a frame after 5 years of feeding the beast in the suburbs. My gear was half-packed in my olive-drab duffel bags, the heavy canvas smelling of diesel and old deployments. The scarred wooden floorboards were cold against my bare feet. At exactly 2,000 hours, the screen on my phone flickered to life. It didn't rattle against the glass coffee table like the desperate, frantic calls from earlier in the week. This was a slow, steady pulse. The name Mom glowed in the dark like a warning light on a dashboard. I picked it up. I didn't say a word. I didn't even say hello. I waited, my back locked straight against the cold plaster wall, my breathing measured and shallow. The silence on the other end was jagged, filled with the ragged, wet sound of an old woman's breathing. Patricia Holloway had delivered the final payload earlier that afternoon. The legal packet had landed on Lorraine's kitchen table like a brick through a window. 60 months of bank statements, every single one of them highlighted in neon yellow. $228,000 of my life stacked up against Carla's grand total of 0. The game of pretend was finally over. I didn't know, Chloe, she whispered. Her voice was thin like wet paper tearing in a winter wind. The crying hadn't started yet. This was the sound of a woman who had finally run out of people to blame and was looking for a way to rewrite the ending. Carla, she told me she was helping you. She swore to me on your father's memory that she was sending you $300 every month. She said you two had an agreement. I thought you were finally acting like sisters. I thought we were a family. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back until the plaster bit into my skull. I didn't feel the fire anymore. There was no cold anger left to fuel me. Just a deep, hollow exhaustion that felt like it had settled into my marrow, heavy as lead. She was still doing it. Even with the evidence staring her in the face, she was trying to use Carla's lies as a shield for her own cowardice. She wanted me to believe she was a victim, so she could keep her hands clean and her conscience clear. She wanted me to apologize for being right. She never sent a dime, Mom, I said. My voice was as flat as a dial tone, devoid of any warmth or pity. She never planned to, and she was pocketing $600 a month from the stranger in my bedroom. Under the table, tax-free. You knew he was there. You walked past his muddy work boots every single morning. You didn't just let her do it. You cheered her on while I was skipping meals to pay for the roof over your head. You let her pimp out my childhood memories for beer money. I just wanted peace, Chloe. She whimpered, and now the tears were starting to flow, predictable as the tide. I'm old. I'm sick. I can't handle this kind of stress. I'm your mother." "No," I replied, the word cutting through her excuse like a razor. "You didn't want peace. You wanted a bank account that didn't talk back. You chose the child who lied to you because she made you feel like a good mother. You punished the child who actually took care of you because I was a reminder of the bills you couldn't pay. You didn't just fail me. You and Carla worked together to bleed me dry." The sob broke then. It was a jagged, ugly sound that made my stomach churn with disgust. "But Chloe, where will I go?" "The bank. The papers from that woman Patricia. They say the house has to be sold. They say you're suing for the equity. You can't put your mother on the street, not after everything I did for you." I looked at my packed bags. I thought about the cupcake with the blue lard frosting she'd given me for my birthday. I thought about the way the laughter sounded when I was lying on the kitchen floor with the air knocked out of my lungs. "I'm not putting you on the street, Mom," I said. "You're going to sell the house. You're going to take whatever equity is left after the bank takes their share, and you're going to rent a small apartment, one you can afford on your Social Security, without me." "I won't survive it," she shrieked. "You're killing me. You're my daughter. You owe me." "I paid my debt," I said. "In full. 228,000 times over. I'm not your bank anymore, and I'm not your maid. From this moment on, don't call this number. Don't send Carla. Don't send anyone. We're done." "Chloe, wait." I didn't wait. I moved my thumb to the red button and pressed down. The line went dead. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was the sweetest thing I'd heard in 5 years. I went into my contacts, found her name, and hit block. Then I found Carla's number and did the same. I sat back down on my mattress and listened to the city roar. My heart rate didn't spike. My hands didn't shake. The umbilical cord was finally severed. It was jagged. It was bloody. But I was finally breathing my own air. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the first hint of gray light touch the Chicago skyline. Tomorrow the movers would be at the red brick house. Tomorrow the for sale sign would go up. But tonight I was going to sleep in my own shithole apartment, and for the first time in 60 months, I wouldn't be dreaming about someone else's debts. The war was over. I was the only survivor. The red brick house on the corner is someone else's nightmare now. It took 6 months for the fire sale to go through, just weeks before the bank was scheduled to slap a heavy padlock on the front gate. Patricia Holloway didn't just play the legal game, she burnt the entire board to the ground. She used that perjury charge like a lead pipe, swinging it until Carla and Lorraine stopped screaming and started signing the settlement papers. When the final check arrived in a plain white envelope, it was for $87,000. It wasn't the full $228,000 I'd bled into that bottomless pit over 5 years, but in the world of urban warfare, you take the win you can get. My credit score dropped exactly 42 points the day the short sale finalized. I sat on my bed in the dark and watched the notification pop up on my phone. 42 points. Collateral damage. I'd seen soldiers lose limbs for less than that. I swiped the notification into the trash and went back to my drink. A 3-digit number on a credit bureau screen couldn't tell me who I was anymore. I was done being a number on someone else's ledger. Carla was gone. She'd crawled into some roach-infested studio on the south side, probably still trying to figure out how a size 11 boot and a coffee-stained Venmo receipt ended her 5-year run of luxury. She was waiting on a court date for the perjury and the housing fraud. Let her wait. Lorraine was tucked away in a mid-tier assisted living spot out in the suburbs. It was clean, it was quiet, and most importantly, it didn't cost me a single cent. She had her own Social Security check now, and she had to make it last until the end of the month, just like everyone else. I took my payout and put a down payment on a high-rise condo. 2 bedrooms. The kind of place where the air smells like expensive wax and filtered ventilation instead of old grease. No more rust-colored water staining the tub. No more pipes that groaned in the middle of the night like they were haunted by the ghosts of my missed mortgage payments. I have a floor-to-ceiling window that looks straight out over the marshland. In the early mornings, the mist clings to the tall grass like a wet blanket, and the sun cuts through the gray like a golden blade. I threw out every piece of clothing that reminded me of that house. Every stained t-shirt and every pair of worn-out jeans I'd worn while scrubbing their filth off the baseboards. I bought silk. I bought real wool. This morning I went down to the cafe in the lobby and ordered a double espresso, $7. I didn't have to open my banking app to see if I could afford the caffeine. I didn't have to calculate if buying a coffee meant I couldn't pay the electric bill. I just tapped my card and walked away. Friday night, the intercom buzzed. It was Margot. She didn't come over to cry about a car payment or beg for a loan because her heating went out. She came over with a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc that was so cold it made the glass bottle sweat in the warm air of my kitchen. She sat on my new leather sofa, the one Carla would have ruined with red wine and cigarette ash in 5 minutes, and she just breathed. "Nice place, Holland," she said, her voice like gravel and old smoke. "It's quiet," I replied. We sat there for 3 hours. We didn't talk about the lawsuit or the 87,000. We talked about the motor pool, the new recruits who couldn't tell a wrench from a screwdriver, and the fact that the wind was finally blowing in our favor. I realized then that family isn't the group of people who share your blood. It's the people who wouldn't dream of bleeding you dry. Loyalty isn't something you owe because of a name on a birth certificate. It's something you earn with every damn action you take. Sunday afternoon arrived with a pale winter sun that didn't provide much heat but looked beautiful on the water. The marsh was quiet, the tall grass stilled by a thin skin of ice. I stood in my kitchen, my clean modern kitchen, and pulled a tray of cornbread out of the oven. The smell hit me immediately. Butter, honey, and yellow cornmeal. It smelled like my father's Sundays. But the grief didn't have teeth anymore. It was just a memory now tucked away in a box where it couldn't reach out and hurt me. I set the table for one. One white porcelain plate, one glass of cold water. No one was there to tell me I was being selfish for wanting a moment of peace. No one was there to push my chair out from under me or call me the help. The silence in the condo was absolute. It was heavy. It was perfect. I took a knife and cut into the bread. I listened to the sound, the sharp, dry crackle of the crust, giving way to the soft, steaming center. I took a bite and looked out at the marsh as the light began to fade into deep purple. The shadows grew long over the reeds, but I didn't mind the dark anymore. I wasn't lonely. I was finally the only person I had to answer to. Pulling back wasn't about being mean or seeking revenge. It was about survival. The war was over. I had my spoils. And for the first time in 60 months, I was finally home.